Hello everyone, my name is Bill Swainson and I'm delighted on behalf of the LitFest Board of Trustees to welcome you to this 42nd Lancaster Literature Festival. As many of you know, after a successful opening weekend, LitFest 2020 had to be cancelled due to COVID-19. So with that in mind and the grim time we have all experienced in the 12 months since, for LitFest 2021, our volunteer board realized it had to work in a different way. We decided to create simultaneously a diverse and inclusive festival and also to create work for some of the freelance artists who struggled during lockdown, and to create a festival that could be delivered entirely online and entirely free. With support from Lancaster City Council and Arts Council England project grant and the help of our sponsors and partners, our aim as we near the end of this long winter lockdown has been both to deliver a rich array of fiction, poetry, illustration and ideas, plus all kinds of activities and challenges. And as a registered charity with no regular Arts Council funding, if we are to be able to go on creating exciting projects and events, bringing the best in world literature and ideas to the northwest of England and to our international audiences, we're going to need your help. During the event, a donate button will appear, and depending on your connectivity, you may prefer to visit our website once the event is over at www.litfest.org, or you can press that button. Whatever you do, every gift will help us to build towards that future where we can actually meet again. But for now, though we're physically distanced, it's great to be socially together. LitFest is delighted to have been able to work with RSPB Leighton Moss to create this family event, which will start with a film and a quiz for everyone, and end with the announcement of a competition for young bird watchers. Now, let me introduce our first speaker. Jon Carter grew up on Morecambe Bay, I should say, first visited Leighton Moss as an 11-year-old and fell in love with it. Today, he is visitor experience manager there, and right now he is going to tell us about RSPB Leighton Moss, introduce a beautiful, short, and I should say silent film, and explain the quiz. So over to you, Jon.
Thank you, Bill. Hello there. Thanks for joining us this evening. For those who don't know, RSPB Leighton Moss and Morecambe Bay Nature Reserve is located in the Arnside and Silverdale area of outstanding natural beauty, right on the border of North Lancashire and South Cumbria. It's just 14 miles from Lancaster, and it's just 2 stops by train from the city centre here. We're home to the largest reed bed in northwest England, and the site has been managed by the RSPB since the mid-1960s. This vast wetland is home to key species including bittern, bearded tit and marsh harrier, along with otters and red deer as well. As well as being a destination for bird watchers and lovers of the outdoors generally, we also deliver high quality kind of curriculum linked educational programs for all ages too. And we host events and family activities and have a visitor centre and a shop and a cafe and all that kind of stuff that you'd expect from an outdoor attraction. Leighton Moss is a lovely place to spend some time at any time of the year. We have lots of trails. We've got 7 viewing heights. We've got a 9-metre high sky tower from which to enjoy the wonderful wetland landscape. Now we're about to show you a short film which was made at Leighton Moss last year, and you should see in it up to 9 different species of birds. Now, what we'd like you to do is have a go at identifying as many of these birds as you possibly can, and so the ones that you spot, and then send your answers in to LitFest into an email addressed to Bill Swainson at litfestbill@gmail.com by the end of this evening. So that's identify all the birds you see in the film, write them all down, send them in an email to litfestbill@gmail.com. Now, one person will win a pair of free entry passes to Leighton Moss, so you can come and visit us, along with a complimentary drink and a piece of cake in our cafe. But obviously, once the lockdown ends, we're hoping to have everything back up and running by April the 12th in accordance with the government guidelines. So please check our website, rspb.org.uk/Leighton Moss, or see the Leighton Moss Facebook page or Twitter account. We'll be updating information around our opening and reopening there. So it'd be lovely to have you come and visit us, especially, you know, if you win free tickets. That's a really nice way of doing it. In the case of more than one person gets all the species correct, we'll throw it into a hat and Bill will have a rummage around in there and pull out one lucky winner. So it'd be great. So good luck, and I hope to see some of you as soon as you're able to travel to visit us. So that's it for me, really. I think it's just over to the film and let Leighton Moss speak for itself for now.
Thank you very much, Jon. Well, wasn't that just great? Such beautiful sequences. And who'd be a stickleback in Leighton Moss? Now, get your answers to the quiz onto an email and into LitFest, addressed to litfestbill, all one word, @gmail.com by midnight tonight. And who knows, you may be winning a pair of free tickets and a drink and a cake once of course, lockdown ends. And as soon as we retrieve our three speakers, I'll be able to introduce you to Tim Birkhead and Paul Farley. And I'm sorry that oh, here they come. Good. Just a word about the questions. If you did put a question into the chat in the previous session or into the question box, I'm afraid you're going to have to put it back in again because they got left behind in the last session. We're learning as we go along with this new technology. And now that Paul and Tim are with us, let me introduce you to them. Tim Birkhead, Professor Emeritus at Sheffield University, is the author of many acclaimed and prize-winning books, including The Wisdom of Birds, Bird Sense, and The Most Perfect Thing, Inside and Outside a Bird's Egg. He is currently working on a big book about humankind's relationship with birds, from cave paintings more than 40,000 years ago to the uncertain present. Paul Farley has published 5 collections of poetry, most recently the brilliant The Mizzy, which contains many wonderful poems about birds. A frequent presenter on BBC Radio 4's The Echo Chamber, Paul has received numerous awards, including the Whitbread Poetry Prize and the Forster Award. He lives in Lancaster and teaches creative writing at the university. Now it's over to you, Tim and Paul, to tell us how you got started with bird watching and what keeps you hooked.
Yeah.
Thanks, Bill.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. And hello, everybody. And hello, Tim. It's great to see you.
Well, maybe I can start, Paul.
Yeah.
So I was lucky in that my dad was a bird watcher. And so I was encouraged from a very early age. But I don't think my dad ever imagined what a kind of demon he would be releasing by doing that, because by the time I was a teenager, he was kind of regretting it and telling me that if I didn't spend a bit more time at school and doing schoolwork, I would end up working in a cloth factory in Leeds, and that put the fear of God into me. So I did buck my ideas up. But one of the most inspirational things that happened to me was when I was 11, and we were on holiday in North Wales. And my dad took me, leaving my younger brother behind, fantastic, which was great. And we went to Bardsey Island, which is one of the most beautiful islands anywhere. And we had a just wonderful day, clear blue skies, chuffs flying around everywhere. And as we walked back to the boat at the end of the day, there was a chap sitting on the cliff top with a telescope and a notebook. And my dad just said to me, "You could do something like that when you're a bit older." And the seed was sown. You know, I've never looked back. How about you?
Well, there was no moments of epiphany or anything, and no moments. In fact, I can't remember an individual moments. I can't think of a time when I wasn't really interested in birds or glad of their company. But I think one thing that I think made me notice them more was that from a tender age was that we moved from the city centre, so from the middle of Liverpool, out to the edges when I was about 5 or 6. And this meant moving into a completely new ecology, sound picture, you know, everything was different. And I do remember that. In fact, it's the bird song I remember making an impression of me, even though it was just a roofscape, but it was full of starlings and sparrows and blackbirds and stuff. So it was this very hybrid place, very close to woodland and fields and so on. But it was also a very new build, very urban sort of environment. And at some point, I got hold of a field guide. I mean, maybe that was the moment. You know, I found a field guide, and up until then, I was a really useless, not very knowledgeable bird, and not that I am now either, but I used to confuse names and get things mixed up. So, for example, I used to call a herring gull a heron gull, stuff like that, you know, but then I learnt what the real names were, Latin names, scientific names. Although there were, before that, I should just say before that, there were dialect names. There was a kind of folk language. There was a kind of received folky. So, for example, a starling would have been a shebby, a missel thrush would have been a mizzy. And it's been fun, you know, in later life, that seeing that these words are in were in circulation, and all around the country you can find these different kind of variations for these, you know, local names for different species. But yeah, that was it. That's how I got into it, I think. And it's never left me. Well,
that's really interesting. And I think I realized, I went off to Newcastle to do a degree in zoology. And it suddenly dawned on me that I could actually focus all my zoology degree on birds. And I remember buying this huge book called A Dictionary of Birds, edited by somebody called Lansborough Thompson. And it was £4, which in those days, you know, was a huge amount of money. And it was so well done that, you know, the section on genetics in birds allowed me to do all my genetics revision from this bird book using bird examples. And that really just made a huge difference to me, that everything could be focused on birds. And then, you know, it kind of dawns on you that you know, there might be a career in this. You might be able to spend your life just, well, it sounds a bit over the top. You might spend your life bird watching. You end up as an academic doing some bird watching, but you also do a lot of teaching and a lot of administration as well.
What about poetry? Did you, I mean, because just as I was listening to you then, I thought, when did I first, what came first? The bird poem or the field guide? Or certainly it was the bird in the field preceded both of those things. But then I can't remember the first time I must have read a bird poem. I think it was probably somebody like Ted Hughes, which eventually led to Jon Carter. But this would have been much later. I would have been well into my teens by now, maybe even into my 20s by the time I got to people like Claire. So I was just wondering, did you, while you were finding out how you could maybe this could be a career and a research subject, was there this parallel? Was there a cultural or artistic thing as well running on a parallel track?
Okay, well, that's a really interesting question. So, I mean, I've always been interested in art, and I did art A-level. And at one point I thought maybe this would be the path to go down. And I remember, I think I must have been about 17. I got an interview at Leeds City College of Art, or whatever it was called. And I had full of high expectations. And I used to go past there on the bus for coming home from school. I remember seeing all their paintings in the windows, thinking that's pretty cool stuff. You know, it was the era of psychedelics, you know, images. And I went into this interview, and this very nice young girl showed me around. We went into the studios, and everybody was just lying around smoking. And I just thought, this is not what I want to do. You know, I was eager to get on and do things. And at that moment, I decided, right, university and do zoology. That was the turning point. But from then onwards, I was incredibly narrowly focused on science. And, you know, it's a massive apprenticeship, becoming a scientist. So there wasn't much scope at that point. And it wasn't until, well, kind of middle age, really, that I started looking a bit more broadly. So I'd always been interested in art, but never quite so much in literature. And it wasn't until middle age that I started becoming interested in the history of ornithology and the history of science, and asking myself, how did we get to know what we know about birds? That was the kind of thing at the back of my mind. So I started delving into history, and that eventually leads you into literature and encountering people like Jon Carter and so on.
Do you, I mean, you'll know this, Tim, but poets, maybe artists in general, are meant to have a kind of cultural or a kind of inferiority complex, I suppose, in the company of scientists. You know, Auden, the poet W.H. Auden, famously said he felt like a shabby curate in a room full of dukes whenever he was found himself surrounded by scientists. I mean, do you recognise that, or should we do the two things have a lot more in common than we're letting on, do you think?
Well, yeah, I do reckon I can see that that could be an issue. I mean, a room full of geeks would be a better way of describing it. I mean, to be a scientist, you do have to be a geek. You have to be obsessive, because the career, you know, it sounds idyllic being an academic studying birds, but it's a pretty ferociously competitive situation. You had, I mean, luckily I'm retired now, but you had to earn money for the university. You had to earn your keep by applying for research grants. And so the overheads from those grants kept the university going. And I was lucky in that I was able to do that. But if you weren't that lucky, and some of my colleagues weren't, it was a pretty tough call. You were made to feel pretty inferior. In terms of your specific question, there was one event that happened about 10, 20 years ago, I can't remember exactly, when I was visiting a library near Liverpool. What's the name of the wildlife park on the out? Knowsley.
Knowsley, yeah.
And I was in the library there, and I was looking around, and I found this amazing manuscript, handwritten from 1600. And it was an encyclopedia of birds. It was written in French, and I don't speak very good French. And so I took a few pictures of the pages and came home and did a bit of research. I realized that nobody knew anything about this encyclopedia. It obviously hadn't been published. And I eventually got a grant for a PhD student. And she was co-supervised by me in the science department and someone in the history department and somebody in French. And this was my christening into the humanities. And what a revelation that was. I mean, it was just extraordinary and just a crucial part of my education. All scientists should be exposed to that kind of experience. It was remarkable.
It's so interesting you say that, because I grew up near Knowsley Safari Park, and later in life, just before I left Liverpool, in fact, and moved away, I discovered that that was where the Earl of Derby's menagerie and aviaries were kept. I remember discovering that. So it wasn't just seeing birds, you know, in the field or in fields or on streets. It was another tuning into what ornithology was, or was historically. I mean, we don't collect and keep birds in that way now, or that's frowned upon. But it was thrilling to discover that there'd been, I don't know. I remember thinking it was thrilling that there were grackles and weaver birds,
yeah,
just down the road from where I was. That just seemed incredible, you know. So it's like we've set this up and rehearsed it. We honestly haven't. It's a big deal for me when I was, my late teens.
And that Lord Derby was the first person to breed the budgerigar in captivity. You know, they were brought back by people like John Gould and so on. And Lord Derby, because he was immensely wealthy and had all the facilities, got some budgies. And what did that lead to? You know, everybody in the world now breeds budgies. I mean, phenomenal.
Yeah. I think as well, a broader point is, I think the two things, I mean, you know, scientific and artistic approaches are, they're arriving at the same kind of place, you could argue, aren't they? You know, precision, accuracy, truth, really. Yeah. And observation is important, I'd argue, for both disciplines, you know, without,
absolutely,
you know, we might think barnacle geese come out of driftwood still or whatever. But a John Clare poem, you mention him again, is really, it's a thing that's built out of looking, out of observation, really close observation. And I think there's a clarity of thought too that's common to scientists and, say, poets. And scientists have to be intuitive and creative, otherwise stuff won't happen, right?
I agree with everything you've said, but there is still this kind of two cultures approach. And I remember there was one of my projects has been on trying to understand why guillemot eggs are the funny pointed shape they are. And after a lot of research, we finally figured it out, and we wrote it up in a scientific journal. And I sent it off to, I won't say his name, but a TV personality who deals with wildlife. And I said to him, you know, did you get the paper? And he said, I took one look at it. He said, I didn't understand a bloody word of it. And I went, God, you know, how could I have been so naive And of course, I immediately then set about writing hopefully a much more intelligible account to make it accessible. And if you're a scientist, and I think if you're also in the humanities, you're in a kind of a bit of a rut, and
Right.
you're happily traveling along that. And if you don't have to interact with anybody outside your rut or groove, then everybody understands what you're talking about. But if you suddenly have to speak to other people, then it becomes an issue. And that awakening for me was really crucial, and it fed back into my teaching and writing and so on, making things accessible. And it's about how you use language, and I'm sure that's absolutely true for poets as well.
Yeah, there's a the academy has this kind of dialect which can be pretty unforgiving if you're not used to it or you're not kind of versed in its ways. I mean, looking at it from a different angle, you could argue, you know, sometimes poetry can appear to have that kind of difficulty associated with it. I mean, this is kind of widely known and discussed and so on. But no, it's all about looking, and I really do think they're both arriving in the same place, which is using language to arrive at a truth or a moment of recognition and clarity. They might get there by different means, but those means involve or include observation, close observation, and observation for a long time as well. Claire with his birds in the fields in rural Northamptonshire, you know, a scientist on a small island going back year after year and looking at something closely and measuring it over time.
You kind of realize that after you've done those kind of things, a lot of those experiences that certainly I as a scientist feel, they do become kind of spiritual. You know, they're not just, you know, with blinkers on looking objectively. You know, I studied guillemots for nearly 50 years now. It's my PhD, and I've gone back to Skomer Island every year. And, you know, I kind of jokingly say to people, you know, I'd like to be a guillemot. You know, I know enough about them now. I kind of know how it works. And it's a deep spiritual experience, but it doesn't preclude you being scientific at the same time. So all of those things come together.
Yeah. I just noticed in that lovely film we just watched on Leighton Moss, which I really missed, by the way. It made me kind of really want to get up there. It opens up again soon. We're going to talk a little bit about, because I know you've looked at heronries and herons, and you told me something wonderful about the heronry, or the heron, or the two things, being the most kind of continuously closely observed thing since the 1920s, is it?
Yeah, since 1928 there's been a census of all the heronries in Britain, and it was initially done as a kind of test case on how you monitored a bird population. So at that time in 1928, herons weren't threatened in any way. It was just a relatively easy species to monitor. And I've had a long association with herons, because when I was at school, they became my kind of project. And I just loved herons. They're so big and striking, and, you know, slightly gothic in their appearance. And my local patch was a place called Farnley Hall in the Washburn Valley. And on the estate there was a pond, very eutrophic pond, and it was like a magnet for herons. And I used to go there and watch them. And when the birds had finished feeding, they would go into the nearby fields and stand around. And these were called heron standing grounds. And I kind of tried to read up on it, and nothing was known about this. You know, why did herons go and stand together in a group of a dozen or more? And I thought, right, this is the project for me. So as a teenager, I spent hours and hours and hours watching herons do sweet very little. They just stood there. You know, it was kind of, and it took me a long time to realize that basically this was a daytime roost, and the whole point was not to do anything. But those hundreds of hours spent watching them, that was my kind of apprenticeship in terms of being patient and so on. Now, the problem was that Farnley was private, and you know, I went a lot. And then one day our local doctor came to the house, and he took me to one side and he said, I understand you've been on Farnley Estate. And I said, yes. He said, well, the owner's not very happy about you trespassing there. So and if you want to go, you have to ask permission. But I was too shy ever to ask permission. And then later in the conversation, he said, and of course you realise in the hall itself there are paintings by J.M.W. Turner. And I said, really? And he said, yes, there's many paintings of birds that Turner did as a guest when he was staying at Farnley Hall. And I was absolutely intrigued. But of course, because I'd blotted my copybook by trespassing, I didn't dare ask permission to go and see the Turner paintings. But for me, it was enough simply knowing that they were there, and that Turner, and because I was passionate about art, and that Turner was passionate about birds, I thought this is the most fantastic connection. And then literally about 2 years ago, I drove up in that region and I passed Farnley Hall, and all those memories came flooding back. I thought, wow, this is... And I went on the internet and I found that the original owner, who'd obviously disapproved of my visits, he'd passed away, but his son was there, and you could book a visit. I just couldn't believe my luck. So I booked a visit, and the owner, Guy Fawkes was his name, part of the famous Guy Fawkes family, was incredibly welcoming and took me into the house and showed me the Turner paintings. And that was one of the high spots in my entire career, and brought the kind of whole Heron story to a nice end.
Yeah, I mean, I can't match that, but I can say I was on the other side of the Pennines, roughly, doing kind of the same thing. Although my herons were never plural, and I don't think there were any. Well, there will have been standing grounds, I'm sure, but I never came across any of them. They were solo artists, and I often saw them by themselves. Lots of drainage ditches, ponds and stuff around the edge of the city there, and so they were a big deal as well. I mean, it was a big deal to see a heron. They're very impressive, like we've just seen in the film. They didn't look like anything else around there, and they're predatory. I mean, you're witnessing a hunt in progress. You're seeing stealth, concentration, absolute focus. And I also think, and I still think to this day, there's something very cinematic about herons. It's all you're watching a photograph, and when it moves, it becomes moving footage. There's something very filmic about it, if that isn't a stretch. That they go from a still to moving imagery very, very kind of gradually, and it's a marvelous visual effect. Breathtaking still, and they seem to crank themselves into life, and they kind of go widescreen. So I was doing kind of a similar thing. We were both spending a lot of time looking at herons, by the sound of it.
And then you used your heron experience to write a wonderful poem about them. And I was wondering whether we can persuade you to read that or say that poem to us, because when we met 3 or 4 years ago, and we talked about that. I mean, that was again an incredibly memorable moment for me. That the poem just captures everything there is about herons.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Norman. There's a Scottish poet, Norman McCaig, said he said there should be a moratorium on poems about herons or containing. It's seen as kind of old or well used material, the heron. I don't think I knew that at the time, though. Luckily, so it didn't put me off. Yeah, I'll read it. I mean, it's tricky. I don't really like saying too much about these things, because you always end up kind of rationalizing where these things came from and trying to kind of make sense of things after the event. But it's got something to do with all those childhood herons we've just been talking about. And but the poem actually got going in Grasmere. I saw one do this peeved sort of testy sort of takeoff from the lake, from the island in the middle of the lake. So it's all very Wordsworthian, and it's not a very Wordsworthian poem, of course. So I'll just read it, and I should just say to everybody listening, it's a bit mucky at the beginning. There's an outburst of profanity, and so forgive me for that. Maybe turn the sound down or something. So here we go. The heron. One of the most begrudging avian takeoffs is the heron's "fucking hell, all right, I'll go to the garage for your flaming fags" cranky departure. Though once they're up, their flight can be extravagant. I watched one big spender climb the thermal staircase, a calorific waterspout of frogs and sticklebacks, the undercarriage down and trailing. Seen from antiquity, you gain the Icarus thing. Seen from my childhood, that cursing man sets out for super kings, though the heron cares for neither, as it struggles into its wings, then soars sunwards and throws its huge overcoat across the earth.
Fabulous. That's great. I think perhaps we should now hand over to the question and answer session, see if anybody's got any questions for us.
Well, they have. And here we go. Thank you. That was a lovely conversation and beautiful reading, Paul. Thank you. So I'm going to start with a historical question. It's actually something I picked up from the chat, so it wasn't really framed as a question, but I'm going to turn it into one. Someone I know, Chris Hayes, commented that going back a few centuries, country clergymen were often great naturalists, knew their area and its wildlife intimately, and left wonderfully detailed records of their observations. Now, this is a question really, I think, for you, Tim, which is, when you were writing The Wisdom of Birds, you would have known about these and come across these country parson naturalists. Do you want to just tell us about one of them and what they contributed?
The ultimate of those country parsons, of course, was Gilbert White and his Natural History of Selborne. And what he did was, they were contrived letters between himself and a couple of correspondents, and he basically told them what he'd seen and what he was thinking, and sometimes they were real letters and his correspondents replied. But Gilbert White just wrote in such a wonderfully lyrical kind of way. I mean, it's just a lovely, lovely book to read, and full of perceptive insights. And of course, it was so successful. It was published in 1795. It was so successful, it spawned a whole culture of basically clergymen writing similar kinds of accounts. And it kind of launched an entire generation of nature writers. And as I say, Gilbert White's Natural History of Selborne is still worth reading today. I think it's never been out of print. It's a wonderful book.
Thank you. Now I have a question from Ross Heyman, and this one's for Paul. I've always wondered if the thorn bush in your poem Thorns was actually on the slopes of Helm Crag or somewhere else near Grasmere. And also, where are your favourite places in the lakes for bird watching?
The thorn was near Helm Crag. Yeah, I was a resident poet there about 20 years ago, and I was very taken by this thing, The Lion and the Lamb, which is still there. It's a kind of rock effect. Depending on how you look at it, you can see this. But there was a kind of thorn bush there as well, which you could do a similar kind, or I did a similar kind of thing with it. I mean, on a much smaller scale. And I remember going up Helm Crag in the snow because Wainwright had called it a little essay in mountaineering. I want some of that. So I remember going up Helm Crag and seeing this thorn for the first time, and then saw it a few times. I was there 2 years. So yes to that question. And sorry, the other question, where's the best places to go in the lakes? I mean, my favourite places I wouldn't go that far up. And funnily enough, when I was in Grasmere, it was a little bit monocultural for birds. I thought there were lots of jackdaws in Grasmere, I remember. It was kind of jackdaw central, you know. I've got to say Leighton Moss, which is on the kind of edge, the other side of the bay, but it's on the edge of the lakes. But also shout out for places up the Lune Valley as well. There's some lovely oak woodland up the Lune Valley. So you can get things like, I really like waiting for the pied flycatchers to come in the spring, things like that, you know. And there's lots of these little kind of places around. If you go kind of in a slightly different direction, which I'm afraid isn't the Lake District, but I did want to kind of just, like I say, give them a shout out. Sorry.
Okay, the next question is from Joe Taylor. I've just read the chapter on migration in The Wisdom of Birds. Why were so many scientists so reluctant to concede to migration and even going to the extreme of making up evidence? And obviously this one's for you, Tim.
Okay, that's a great question. There's a curious divide in birds, in that some birds migrate by day, cranes and storks, for example, and right back into Aristotle's time, nobody ever doubted that they migrated, because they could see them setting off across the sea, and they could see them coming back in the beginning of spring. But it was small birds, swallows and warblers and so on. It was them that caused the problem, because they migrate at night, and of course you never saw them. You just woke up one morning and all the swallows had gone. And people just couldn't imagine that a little bird like a warbler could fly across the oceans for hundreds of miles and survive. And so it just seemed much more plausible to imagine that they'd gone into hibernation, because they knew that things like dormice and so on hibernated. And of course, Gilbert White, who we were just talking about, he couldn't bring himself to believe that the swallows and martins in his village migrated. And he thought that they were probably hiding themselves in hollow trees in the woodland around the wakes where he lived. And he even sent his men out in the winter with sticks to bang on the hollow trees to see whether it would frighten out the hibernating birds. And of course it didn't. But those ideas about birds hibernating were reinforced by the very occasional late migrants. So just occasionally, today even, you might see a house martin or a swallow in late November. And people like Gilbert White goes, there you go. I knew that they were spending the winter here. And it's a warm day. They've just popped out for a bit of food before going back to sleep in the hollow tree.
Terrific. Now we have one for you, Paul, from Adam Strickson. So often, as in the fantastic Heron poem, poets bring the human in, and the bird becomes a human individual or type at some point. Writing, I do this a lot, but sometimes feel uncomfortable about it, because it kind of takes me away from the close observation you were talking about. Is it okay to humanize birds? Or should we let them find themselves somehow in a poem? I can't stop the humans entering, almost as if the birds wear human masks.
Yeah, anthropomorphism and so on, and casting these kind of human attributes onto the animal, onto the bird in this case. I like the idea of the animal having a kind of agency. There's a wonderful book called Translations from the Natural World by Australian poet Les Murray, where I think that's the kind of thing that's going on. It's trying to imagine how that kind of perspective can be. And of course, it's impossible in a sense, because using human language. And there are wonderful essays by people like, you know, that one by Thomas Nagel, What It Is to Be a Bat. And a couple of books a few years ago, one called Being a Beast, where somebody tries to, what's it actually like to a badger or a fox and so on. So to try to get the non-human perspective, but you're always, in the end, using language. I think in a poem, you're trying to use language in a way that kind of gets on the back of itself and tricks itself and renders the thing kind of there in the room with you. Yes, it's. I think it's okay to do it. I don't think there's a problem with doing it. But yes, one often wants to go beyond that, beyond just kind of, you know, anthropomorphizing the animal, and to go to another place where the creature might be able to kind of be allowed to have a mind of its own and a non-human perspective. But it's very difficult. But who said poetry was easy? You know, it's an excuse to keep trying to do it, I guess.
Well, it's funny you should mention Thomas Nagel, because the subtitle for Tim's second book that we worked on together at Bloomsbury was Bird Sense. The title was Bird Sense, and the subtitle was a nod towards Thomas Nagel. Do you want to just talk about that a bit?
Yeah, well, the subtitle was what it's like to be a bird. And Nagel came to the conclusion that we could never know what it was like to be a bat. No, we could never know what it was like to be another organism. But in fact, as a scientist, I disagreed with that, because there are now techniques, mainly through the study of animal behavior, that give us a very good sense to know what it's like to be another organism. I agree that it's still a challenge, but we're much more knowledgeable about that now than we were in the past. And my aim in doing that was to make people kind of realize that birds, there was some really sophisticated stuff going on in birds' brains. And the trigger for me writing that book was I was studying my guillemots on Skoma. I was in a hide very close to a group of guillemots. And the female guillemot, who was incubating an egg right in front of me, suddenly stood up and started giving the greeting call. And my brain went, this is very odd, because they don't normally do this until the partner's with them. And I looked out to sea, and there were birds flying everywhere. And within a few seconds, a bird landed beside this female, and she had recognized her partner from about 700 meters distance, whereas to me, it just looked like a brown blob, any other guillemot. And suddenly my entire perception of what it was like to be a bird was transformed by that single encounter. I've never looked at them in the same way since. There's just so much more going on in a bird's brain. And part of my motivation for writing about that was that if we appreciated that about birds, we might be better motivated to help protect them in the future.
Thank you. Now, we've got two questions which are in different ways really asking the same thing. I'm going to take the one from Kath Drake. Kath says, I'm from the Southern Hemisphere and know very little about birds in England. Where do I start? Where should I go in London? How can I learn more?
It's been a long time since I've lived in London. I mean, there's parakeets in London. There's kind of amazing things going on in London. Tim D told me a woodcock landed near him once in a street in London. So I guess you never quite know what's going to happen. I don't know whether there's any huge starling murmurations anymore on the edges of London. But there are lots of corridors, lots of parks and things in central. London's quite a leafy city, so there's lots going on. Do you know London well, Tim?
No, I don't really, but I mean, I visit for meetings and so on. But the parks, as you say, are very rich in bird life. And then, of course, there's the London Wetland Centre, which is on a little bit out of the centre, which is incredibly rich and diverse. I mean, I think that a good thing to do would be to join a bird club. And bird clubs deal with a huge range of expertise. So there will be some really keen birds are called twitchers that are interested in ticking off as many different species as they can. But at the other end of the scale, there'll be people that just have a general interest in birds. And I really like the fact that you can engage with birds in so many different ways. So joining a bird club and not being afraid to ask innocent or naive questions initially, and that's how you would learn and pick up information. And I mean, there's so many popular books about birds these days. That's a great way to get into that kind of subject.
Thank you. And then the last question that we have time for relates directly to what Jon's going to come back and talk about in a minute. What advice would you give to a young person with an interest in birds or nature, but unsure what to read, watch, or do to pursue this? This could be for both of you.
It's so difficult because I'm remembering myself at that tender age I was talking about earlier, it seemed like forever to figure out there was a thing called a field guide, and that there were plates, and you could kind of match those to what you were looking at, and then that was a kind of portal to all kinds of other things, descriptions of the bird's song, albums as they were then, with these spectacularly sort of patrician sort of voices that would go, you know, wood warbler, and then you get the all of that stuff. So a whole world opened out from just kind of from the field guides onwards for me. But that was a long time, it was a very long time ago. And now I imagine it's changed so much. Those clubs Tim was just mentioning, the different ways you can. I mean, when you look at the internet, for example, the way you can kind of match song with field description, with sightings, things seem to tie up a lot more. There seems to be a kind of richness of resource as well, and often almost in real time. So, you know, if I'm going somewhere, I'll often have a look around to see who's been there recently and see what's about. I mean, you could do that years and years and years ago, but it was a completely different process and a lot slower. So my sense of it is that it's richer and possibly easier, but I don't know. What do you think, Tim?
I think it is easier, and you can do a lot of stuff on your phone now that helps you identify things. You can take a picture on your phone, and then there's a little app that will help identify it. Some birders are kind of worried that kind of dissociates you from the real thing. So, and I think there's an element of that, but there's also an element of deep satisfaction of having instant identification, instant gratification. But I would strongly advocate getting out there and trying to watch birds. The current way that most people watch birds, and I'm sure this is true at Leighton Moss now, is, you know, you walk on a wooden walkway and you go and sit in a hide. You know, when I was growing up, those kind of things were almost unheard of, and you had to be grubbing around in the undergrowth in your wellies and notebook and field glasses in hand. But I think both of those approaches are still good ways to go.
Well, that's great. Now we're at the end of the Q&A, and Jon Carter is going to come back in a minute and tell us about the 3 best sites for bird watching in the Northwest, in addition to RSPB Leighton Moss. And he's also going to explain LitFest competition for young bird watchers. Over to you, Jon.
Oh, yeah, that was great. I could sit and listen to you two for hours and hours and hours, really. You've asked me to think of 3 best places to go bird watching in the Northwest. That's a kind of an impossible task, frankly. We're kind of blessed. There's so many great places in this region. I mean, how do I choose between Tim's Guillemots all over St Bees Head up in Cumbria, or the Terns at Hodbarrow, or Martin Mere, or the Ribble Estuary, which is just an amazing place, Burton Mere Wetlands on the Wirral, Marside. I mean, it goes on and on and on. There are lots of places. So if you forgive me, I'm going to concentrate actually on this area and places you can go to within a very short distance of here. Now, obviously, Leighton Moss is #1. There's no question about that. I discovered that at the age of 11 and never changed my mind since. But within, you know, spitting distance of Lancaster, you've got lots of really great places around Morecambe Bay, the Forest of Bowland, all within really easy reach, and offering lots of things. I mean, Paul mentioned earlier about things like pied flycatchers in the wooded valleys. Yeah, springtime in Bowland and the Loon Valley, redstarts and cuckoos and tree pipits and all that kind of stuff in these lovely areas. And you can get out there and kind of just take nice, pleasant, leisurely walks, be surrounded by some really, really fantastic birds. You don't have to go too far. Places like Sunderland Point on the Loon Estuary, and the Loon Estuary itself, all the way from Glastondock right the way into the city centre, really. That's my favourite area. I go to a place called Old Cliff Marsh and spend all my time birding there when I'm not working. And that's just, you know, the seasonal change, the kind of the change of birds that just comes around all year round. It's really, really fabulous. I suggest people go out and find their own places in a way, discover your own local patch, you know, enjoy, but also come to Leighton Moss regularly as well, I must add. But find your own place, that means something to you. Here, you mentioned bird clubs earlier. We have a pretty active local bird club, the Lancaster and District Birdwatching Society, which has been going since the 1950s. So we do lots of kind of active survey work, but we also do kind of, you know, regular meetings and things like that. So I mean, that's a great way of getting involved locally, wherever you are. Find your local bird club, get involved, see what you can learn. There'll be always people who've lots of experience. They'll be publishing reports, so it gives you some context of the birds in your area. That's really worth doing. But to move on to the competition element, we've got a little competition for young bird watchers aged between 11 and 16. And what we'd like you to do is submit a page of writing and or a drawing about your favourite bird and tell us about the first time you spotted it. Or you can share an encounter that you had with any aspect of nature. Maybe it doesn't have to be a bird. Perhaps you came face to face with a hedgehog or a sparrowhawk, or a frog, some fungus, something that just inspired you. What did you notice? How did it make you feel? I don't think there's a word count, is the bill. I think we're just going to go for whatever people feel they wish to write.
A page of writing.
A page, exactly. So it could be 5 very large letters on one page. It's succinct and beautiful, yeah. So the winners will win a guided walk at Leighton Moss. I'll probably be the person taking you around and showing you the birds, and we'll do some birdsong stuff and all that kind of thing. And you'll be bringing a guardian or a parent with you as well. So if you could submit your writing and or drawing to Bill Swainson at info@litfest.org, which is the website, isn't it? Right, via that, or is that the actual email address, Bill?
That's our general email address.
Okay, so info@litfest.org, or you can post it the old-fashioned way to the Litfest address.
Right. Thank you very much, Jon. Before we all go our separate ways, if you enjoyed today's event, don't forget to click on the donate button on your screen, or go to our website if that's easier afterwards. Every penny will go towards creating exciting future projects and events and strengthening Litfest as an independent arts charity. I'd also like to say, if you would like to buy any of Tim or Paul's books, we have them in the online festival bookshop. So while Waterstones and Blackwells are closed in the town and at the university in Lancaster, you can go on our website and order Tim's Bird Sense and His Most Perfect Thing. And a number of Paul's books of poems are also available. And that too will contribute to Litfest's future projects. So it only remains for me to say thank you to all of you out there for joining us today. Thanks again to Tim Birkhead and Paul Farley and Jon Carter, and particularly to RSPB Leighton Moss for lending us their film. Can't wait to see it edited and with a soundtrack added. We saw 4 minutes of about 10 minutes, I think. So there's much more to come. And Litfest will hope to see some of you again soon at tomorrow's fiction event, perhaps in the morning, with James Clark and Sarah Moss, who will be talking about landscape and fiction, or for our poetry weekend, which culminates in an event celebrating the places of poetry in the Northwest. And we've been running a live poetry map for a time on that. So once again, thank you for joining us. Thank you to our speakers, and see you again soon. Goodbye.